All right, let's open up our Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy, and we will be wrapping up our look through the book of Deuteronomy, the textual survey on Wednesday. We'll go back through and look at the connections between Deuteronomy and the rest of the books of Moses, and then Marshall will wrap up next week looking at the connections between Deuteronomy and the New Testament. So we're picking up in Deuteronomy 27 this morning, and just incidentally, next Wednesday, not this Wednesday, but the next Wednesday, we'll begin a new quarter, and we'll be looking at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and I'll have that material available to you soon, the questions for that, and so we'll be, of course, continuing on with the next section of the text. But Deuteronomy, beginning in chapter 27, one of the ways that we've talked about breaking up the book, this last section would be a focus on the covenant, and both from the standpoint of thinking in terms of the consequences and rewards of keeping or not keeping the covenant, and then also looking at sort of Moses' farewell, we'll see that, and looking into Israel's future, as far as what their future is going to look like as they fail to keep the covenant, and then as they return from their failure to keep the covenant. So beginning in chapter 27, and really for 2 chapters here, there's this litany of blessings and cursings. And so the first thing that we want to do here is summarize that. Give me a summary of what Moses is telling the people here in chapters 27 and 28.
Starts by saying that they would pronounce curses on anyone who showed any sort of contempt toward parents, anyone who disobeys the law in any way, whether idolatry, movers of boundary markers, fornication of any kind, one who attacks a neighbor secretly, one who refuses to confirm. I like that, by the way. You refuse to confirm the words of this law by obeying it, or by disobeying it instead. And then he goes on to pronounce upon them blessings in every area of life: children, livestock, produce, in battle, treasure. He would bless them in every way more than any other nation. And then the curses are sort of a mirror image of those, but ratcheted up a bit, if you can say that. The cursing section is longer, so disease, blight, drought, weakness and defeat, death, shame, infidelity and defilement, plague, theft and plundering, want and longing, starvation, captivity, scattering among the people, slavery and terror. So too horrible to imagine it. He says you have to look here to know, in order to avoid being unfaithful.
Okay. All right. So as you say, too numerable to note. The blessings are thorough and saturating all of life. The cursings are thorough and saturating all of life. One of the things that we'll see, that you see as far as connecting this to other texts, I think this and as we looked at in Leviticus chapter 26 are places where the prophets will repeatedly pick language up from these texts and say to the people, what is happening is exactly what God said would happen. And I think that's particularly important because one of the things that the prophets, and not just the prophets, but really I think 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, one of the things that they want to emphasize to the people is that what's happening is not God abandoning you, right? It's not God stepping back and just being uninvolved all of a sudden. No, this is continuing to be a faithful God. So that even when judgment is coming, it's not evidence of an unfaithful God. No, it's a God saying he's doing exactly what he said he would do. And that's very important. If you're the one going through captivity, it's actually better to hear that God is behind this than that God is gone, right? Because if God is behind it, then I can still interact with that, right? I can still say, okay, there's a path forward, because not only does he tell me how I would be cursed, but how I would be blessed. And so I think it's important from that standpoint, certainly. As we look at these blessings and cursings, what are some of the things that you think that we can learn from that today?
I think one thing we need to learn is that the commands, the instructions God has given us today is just as inherent upon us to be obedient to those as it was to the children of Israel in the time that the law of Moses was given. And, we see the basic laws of how we treat one another. All these laws fall from the two greatest commandments that Christ revealed to us in the New Testament, that is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and soul and mind, and then to love thy neighbor as thyself. And so, are we doing that today? Are we being obedient today? Are we following those commands today? And if not, then we look at our lives and maybe it's not so blessed.
Yeah. This is a simple, or we could simplify it down to a simple rubric, a simple instruction, which is, if you do what I say, it will go well. If you don't, it will go poorly. And that is a message that I think gets drowned out in a lot of oversimplifications, maybe of Paul's arguments in the New Testament and so forth, like obedience doesn't matter anymore. All through, it's God saying, this will bring life, this will bring destruction, over and over again. Choose life, choose life, choose life. That's really one of the, I think, key aspects of Deuteronomy, is he's giving a choice. What do you want? Do you want blessing or do you want cursing? And if you obey God, blessing. If you disobey God, it will be curses. And I think that's such a simple element that we don't ever, no matter what complex arguments we're looking at, don't lose sight of that very simple aspect of following God leads to blessings, disobeying leads to curses. What else? Brad?
One of the curses that really caught my attention, cursed is the one who makes a carved or molded image, an abomination to the Lord, the work of the hands of the craftsman, and sets it up in secret. Your sin will find you out. None of this. Don't think that you can somehow do this and God doesn't know this. God will notice every single, even what you think is the hidden, a bit of unfaithfulness.
Right. So not only do we have a community aspect to all of this, that it will destroy the community, destroy the nation, but you individually are not excluded from that. It's not just if the whole nation participates. A lot of times we think, whatever you do in the privacy of your own home. Well, maybe from civil standpoints and so forth, but from a sin standpoint, like, there are no boundaries. There are no secret places for sin, as it says, God will find you out. Trevor?
I think there's also a lesson of importance. If we spiritualize this to our time and our day, that it was important enough to God to take away everything from their life to get them to do the right thing. And so how much more important is it for us, even if we don't have the exact same physical consequences hanging over our head, spiritually it's still more important than anything else that we have going on in our life. And we have to be willing to make that sacrifice to maintain that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the Hebrew writer says, how much more important, right? And so it doesn't decrease. As you look at the sternness of these warnings, the sternness of the curses and so forth, a lot of people read that kind of thing there in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, and they're like, ooh, I'm glad we don't live under that anymore. You're taking the wrong idea. That's the wrong conclusion. If he thought that under Moses, the Hebrew writer says, how much more under the blood of Christ? So when the covenant has been purchased with the blood of Christ, it becomes that much more important. Any other thoughts here? What about, let me ask this. So he as Brad pointed out, tells them that they will be blessed in all of these physical ways, and that they will be cursed in all of these physical ways. Does our behavior still have connection to physical blessing and physical cursing? Yes. That's right. Right? So I think because maybe it's not as immediate and not quite as direct, but it's still true. And as Brad says, if it's not true, then the Proverbs aren't true anymore. right? The connectivity between blessings and obedience to God remains intact. And I think sometimes we over-spiritualize that and say it's only physical blessings and only physical curses, and that is simply not true. Now, it's not a one-to-one ratio. Even Proverbs was not that. The book of Job pushes back against that notion. The book of Ecclesiastes pushes back against that notion. It's not you do wrong and immediately here's the consequence and that's going to happen every single time. That's never been the case. But the arc of culture, of reality, of life on earth is that if you do these things, it will go well for you. If you do these things, it will go poorly for you. And so again, while the consequences and even the blessings may not be as immediate, I think they are still true. To the point that I think it's reasonable for people to think in terms that people and nations still are blessed and suffer in so much as they come closer to or farther away from the truth of God's word. And I think we need to be careful that we don't just throw all of that in the trash can and say that's Old Testament notions and now we live under New Testament notions and those things are disconnected. God's commands are connected to the reality of the creation that he put into order. And so when we disobey them, these are not just God bringing disconnected punishments to bear, but rather connected creational punishments to bear. And so I think that's one of the things we can learn. You reap what you sow. That has never changed, right? And so, yes, so we want to make sure we keep the sort of thought processes intact even as we move into the New Testament. All right, coming into chapter 29. In chapter 29, and beginning in verse 1, he says, "These are the words of the covenant which Yahweh commanded Moses to cut with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he had cut with them at Horeb." How does that describe what follows in chapters 29 and on into 30?
The next couple of chapters really kind of, to me, lay out the terms, the importance of the covenant that God is making with people.
Okay, lays out the terms of the covenant. All right, what else?
Maybe if we covered in a previous class, the idea that this is not a covenant that God made with your fathers, this is a covenant that God is making with you.
Okay, all right, so not just with the fathers, but also with those who are listening to Moses at this point, right before they go into the land of promise. What else? Let me just say this. The reason we're asking this question is this is an introductory statement. What's following are these words, right? This is what's following. He's telling you what he's about to tell you. And then the question is, how is this reflective of what he just told us he was going to tell us? How is this reflective of these are the words of the covenant? Oh, I want to suggest this, that as you go through chapter 29 and on into 30, you have, building on what Brad just said, you have past, present, and future of the covenant. You have how the covenant began. You have the covenant as it is currently, right? It's you now. And then you have the covenant as they will continue to interact with it, both poorly and as they return to the covenant, right? This is how it's going to work. You're going to break the covenant. And this is what's going to happen when you break the covenant. And this is what's going to happen when you return to the covenant, right? So it's sort of talking about how the covenant is actually, it's not just the terms from the standpoint of here's what you should do and here's what you shouldn't do. Here's what's going to happen when you do that and when you don't do that and when you return to that, right? All of that is in play as he describes here in chapters 29 through 30 what Israel's history has been and what Israel's history is going to be. And so I think it's helpful to think of that in terms of when we look at Israel's history, we generally think of it as sort of disconnected from the covenant, but it's really connected to the covenant. Everything that's happening to Israel, both when they succeed and when they fail, it's connected to the covenant. that either they are reaping the blessings of that covenant or they're reaping the consequences of that covenant. And I think that's helpful to us, again, because it helps us frame that in terms of God is always being faithful. No matter what's happening, he's being faithful to the covenant that he made with Israel. Their faithfulness rises and falls. His does not. It is a rock. All right. Then as we continue through, Marshall asked, how has God proven his faithfulness to the Israelites, and how were the Israelites to respond? And how would they respond?
Basically, God protected them, cared for them in the wilderness, against other nations, things like that. So he showed faithfulness, so they were to respond by keeping all the words of the covenant. And then how would they respond? Eventually, they would not keep the words of the covenant.
Yeah. So he would be faithful and they would not. That eventually they would reject. All right. As you come down then to chapter 29 and verse 29, which is, for passages from Deuteronomy, I would say this one is fairly well known, or at least half of it is. What is the purpose? How does chapter 29 and verse 29 fit into the context of what's being said here? Trevor?
He's referring to many things that are far away into the future, to their captivity. And I think it's most strongly a reference to that. That there's details about the future that are not being revealed, but this is sufficient for now.
But this is what?
Sufficient.
Okay. All right. So the things that are, the mysteries are things that are coming that they can't know. All right. And what has been revealed sufficient? What else?
Well, I think about the idea that God has given them everything they need to know to be faithful and to serve him. And sometimes there are things that even God today has not revealed to us because they're not applicable to our ultimate salvation.
Right. Yeah. All right. Brad?
Because this follows on to follows after his promise to basically to scorch the earth of Israel if they were seduced by idolatry, I thought it probably had something more to do with that. Now, I don't know, maybe this is more of a capstone on the entire thing, but I wondered if it had more to do with the more immediate context. In other words, the Lord has told you what to do and how to behave. People are going to try to persuade you that there are secret things, there are powers untold that we can access through these other gods. God does not want you to. It sounds a lot like Genesis 3. And Moses is trying to reassure them, there's nothing there for you to find. Or if you do find it, you're going to find it's terrible, and you will greatly regret what you do.
Yeah. So maybe a warning against trying to delve into things that you can't even access, even if they are there. I would say this. I think whether it's pointing to a future that they can't discern specifically, or whether it's talking about getting distracted by things you can't, and I think especially for our context, getting distracted by things that we do not have access is a very good application. But the point is, pay attention to what I have revealed. How many people love to delve into and spend all their times on things not revealed while completely ignoring the things that are revealed? Right? This is Mark Twain's quote. It's not the things in the Bible that I don't understand that give me problems. It's the things I do understand. Right? So what he's saying is that it's not that I struggle because there's so much here I don't understand. I struggle because there's a lot I do understand and it's really hard. Or rather, that's what he's saying is it's hard to apply. It's hard to live out. It's not hard to understand. It's hard to do sometimes. And so I think that charge to, hey, I've given you what is necessary. The things God has revealed belong to us and our sons forever, that we may do all the words of this law. So the people who approach God's word and apply the first portion of this to God's word right? That's what people say. They read the Bible, and then they can't understand a particular portion. They go, well, the secret things belong to God. Yeah, but that's not a secret. He put it on the page. That's not one of the things he's talking about. He's saying the things on the page, that's what I did reveal. And I did reveal so that you could understand it and so you could do it. So it's just a terrible misapplication of Deuteronomy 29:29 to brush away something God has revealed as unknowable. Brian?
Yeah. And also, after he's already talked about the curses and what they're going to actually do, it does have some hope there, because going back to the beginning of Deuteronomy, he says, do not add to or take away from these words. He also talks about loyalty to the commandments. Then he talks about how the commandments are accessible. You can do them. So they're sufficient. You can do them. And so all that, I think, just really ties into this revelation. Is God has given this to you. First off, it takes away all excuses. You have no excuses moving forward. And then second of all, when you find yourself in this situation, just do the words that have been revealed, and you will be blessed.
Right. Come back to this. All right. Coming into chapter 30 then, we've already talked about here in 29, we've already introduced you're going to fall away. And as he's talked about that, and now he begins to talk about what it will look like to come back, what would God do for the Israelites after their future restoration?
It says that the Lord would circumcise their hearts.
Yeah, so he would circumcise their hearts. What does that mean?
Want to change their hearts.
Yeah, I'm going to make you actually my people, right? So there's a sense in which you're going to fall away, or a sense in which you are going to fall away. And then he talks about in this restoration, I'm really going to make you my people. It's not just going to be externals, but you're going to internalize. You're going to really love me. You're going to really do the things that I command, and that internal transformation. Where else do we hear talk of this? Jeremiah, particularly chapter 31. Ezekiel, I will give them a heart of flesh. Right? This is constantly talked about in those places where Israel is being taken into captivity, right? That's the context here. So we see those prophets in that context saying, remember what, as they're going away into captivity, remember what God promised about this, that there is restoration. And so they begin picking these promises up and pointing it to the people who have enacted Deuteronomy 29 and have hope because of Deuteronomy chapter 30. Why will God do this for his people? How will God do this for his people?
I think the how is kind of like, I'd say they take the woodshed, the captivity itself is going to be the captivity, and having God's blessings withheld from them for so long. And he talks about them when you're scattered amongst these nations, and then you finally come to realize, oh, it was my sin that caused all this. Then you're going to turn to me and call out to me at a time when I can be found.
Yeah. So as Ezekiel says, one day you're going to look and you're going to loathe yourself. You're going to come back to God understanding what happened. And I think that is the point of, I think the point of 1st and 2nd Kings is to tell the people this is how you got here. I think the point of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is this is how you come back. And so telling their history through those two lenses of this is how you fall away, and then here as you look through that history you see glimpses of the pattern of here's how you come back and restore. Now, jumping ahead a little bit here into the last lesson, ultimately, where does this play out? Yeah, through Christ, right? That's where truly the heart of flesh is put into place. It is through Christ that this will find, through the kingdom of Christ, that this will find its ultimate fulfillment. And so we get Deuteronomy 30 pulled forward, for instance, in Romans chapter 10. We certainly get Jeremiah 31 in Hebrews chapter 8, which is reaching back into Deuteronomy. So it's all pulled forward and saying, here's where it will find its ultimate fulfillment, that we are the people who are truly being pulled out of captivity and given the heart of flesh and so forth. All right. Looking then at Deuteronomy 31 through 33, I have to move forward. I would love to spend more time in chapter 30, but I think it needs to be saved for that final lesson because there's so much connectivity between there and the New Testament. Looking at Deuteronomy 31 through 33, we have the farewell, essentially, where the transfer of leadership is occurring from Moses to Joshua. What is Moses' final counsel there, and the Song of Moses? What all does he have to say in those two contexts?
Take the counsel first. I'm about to die. Joshua is going to lead you. The Lord will be with you if you will be with him, and then you have no reason to fear. The Lord will overthrow the people of the land, same way he did Sihon and Og. And then he charges the priests with reading the law every 7 years during the Feast of Tabernacles. Then finally, he predicts that after my death, one day you're going to forsake the Lord, and he'll punish you. And of course, that's what the song has to say. And then the song, he starts with the foundation. The Lord is great. He is righteous. He's upright. But what's going to happen is that the people are going to corrupt themselves. He will encourage them to recall the former days when the Lord rescued them, and then remind them that they over time grew fat on the Lord's blessings, and that's when they will forsake God. And provoked, the Lord's going to punish them, but he will, in the end, avenge his people and reward them.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. And so I think, and to take a phrase here, I would sum up in this way: be strong and courageous and loyal. Don't ever stop following God. And obviously with all of these details and many more, he emphasizes those particular points. What is, along that lines, of course, what does he say to Joshua? Be strong and courageous, specifically. And of course, that's what Joshua is going to be reminded of. We'll see that as we get into Joshua chapter 1. Do you notice what similarities or differences do you see between chapter 33 and Genesis 49 here as we close out the book?
He's giving, in chapter 49 of Genesis, Abraham is giving the blessings upon his son. And it's kind of the same here in Deuteronomy 33. But there seems to be some subtle differences to me of what is actually taking place with these tribes and the descendants of the sons of Abraham. And yet in some of them they were really close.
Yeah, so the first and most obvious similarity is we're naming the tribes, right? In Genesis 49, they're there, right? The fathers of these tribes are standing there, and Jacob is blessing each of his sons, or pronouncing a blessing of sorts on each of his sons. And then now the tribes, the sons of those sons, are being named each in turn, and again, blessings are being pronounced. So that's the overarching similarity here. And as Sam said, there are some distinctions as you walk through that, as well as some similarities in the specific things that are said. So what are some of the, let's start with what are some of the similarities? Well, what are the differences? I think one thing to note as far as the distinctions is I think Jacob, he goes back and forth between what we would see as very clearly a positive pronouncement, and therefore would call it a blessing. And then sometimes he says things that you're like, I don't know how much of a blessing that is, more of just kind of a description of the reality. He might talk about somebody prospering, and then he might talk about somebody just kind of being a brawler, and so he's kind of all over the board as far as whether it's just unequivocally a good thing or just here's what this tribe's going to be like. I think in this case, Moses is hopefully pronouncing good things, right? So, he would say, for instance, in verse 11, of Levi, bless his substance, accept the work of his hands, crush the loins of those who rise up against him, and those who hate him, so that they will not rise again. This is a request. This isn't saying this is what Levi will do or what Levi's enemies will do. This is what Moses hopes for Levi, right? And I think that's the general tenor as you walk through all of these pronouncements, is Moses is hopeful that good things will happen to all of these tribes, and pronounces them, I think, in accordance with the nature of each tribe. Whereas Jacob is just going and saying, this is what this tribe will be, and this is what this tribe will be. While we call what Jacob does blessing, it is a little bit like the way Isaac blessed Esau, right? Which when Esau said, don't you have anything left for me? And Isaac says, here's what I got. This is what's going to be. And some of it sounds positive, but a lot of it just sounds like, that's just going to be the way it is. And so I think that's a distinction to be drawn here. Let's come on down here to the death of Moses in chapter 34. I want to say, first of all, that I think as you get to the death of Moses, that the first time we walk through the text like this, like going through book by book and studying the entirety of Scripture when we were in Montgomery. They'd never done that before, never looked at the book of Leviticus in a study or anything like that. So we did that. We came all the way to here, and several people just noted, I care more about this passage than I ever have before. This is a big moment. If you look, when we were in England and we went to the Churchill Museum, one of the things that was particularly impressive is the death of Churchill and the national mourning that occurred at the death of Churchill. You see this when you see national heroes die. It can be pretty impressive to see how much, and not just from the top down where they're, the pomp. And I'm talking about people lining the streets everywhere that casket passes through, 4 and 5 people deep, just to pay some sort of respect and homage to this hero. Moses puts them all in the shade. And so when you get to the death of Moses, it is a sobering thing, and it is, it should stir up that kind, I think, of respectful response for all that has come before. A few things to note here, and I'm going to take them in a little bit of a different order here than the text and what Marshall has here. But first of all, what set Moses apart from the prophets who arose after him?
His relationship to God was face to face.
Yeah, unique. It is not that God's revelation was any softer or of less quality with any other prophet, but his relationship was distinctly closer. God points it out. God makes it known when anybody questions Moses, my relationship with Moses is like none other. And so the text tells us, not before, not since. The only prophet that would ever come that would match this relationship would be Jesus. And so when Jesus comes, one of the connections to Moses is nobody has had communion with God like this since Moses, right? There's a gap between Moses and Jesus. And so he rises up. He's the one that truly fits the bill of Deuteronomy 18, as we talked about. A prophet like Moses would arise because of the uniqueness. Of course, it tells us who succeeds Moses. I won't even ask that. It's a gimme. Obviously, Joshua. What did God allow Moses to see before he put him to death on Mount Nebo?
Promised land.
Yeah. And as we look at that, there are lots of different ways, well, at least a couple of different ways that people interpret that. I think too often, people interpret it as look at what you missed out on. And certainly, there's a sense in which he's missing out, right? And it's not to say Moses doesn't want that. We've seen throughout this text, Moses asked God, and he asked God repeatedly until God says, don't ask again, right? You're not going in the land. So it's not that Moses didn't want to go there. But, of course, the whole context, not even that's all laid out here in chapter 34, is what happens when Moses dies. Where does Moses go? Moses goes to the promised land. And the one that is only foreshadowed by the promised land that he's able to see. And so I think that there is a way to consider this. God, here, he is extolling Moses. As Moses dies, God is not berating Moses and saying what a failure he was and why he won't go into the land and so forth. This is not a story about what Moses is missing out on. This is the story about what a great man of God has accomplished. And that while he, because of that failure, is not going to be able to put this, the promised land, the copy, the shadow of the promised land, he's not going to be able to put that on his resume. But he closes his eyes on the shadow and opens them to enter into the real promised land. Moses didn't miss out. And I would just point out, as has been pointed out before, there's a sense in which Moses does get to stand in the promised land. Because in Matthew chapter 17, as well as other passages, we have the transfiguration. And there's Moses in the promised land on the mount with Jesus and Elijah. So he didn't even miss out on that, ultimately getting to go into the promised land. But I can only imagine that would be such a small concession next to what he did inherit and what reward he did gain. All right. I'll leave the application to you. Moses says in Psalm 90, teach us to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. How can we number our days and how can we gain wisdom from that? We'll pick up on lesson 24 on Wednesday.